9 kilometers of border length. More roads mean better and less expensive transportation options for more people, which means a better ability to conduct trade and business, and a correspondingly better ability for more people to capture more capital for themselves. But that's only the first problem the jungles suffer from an economic development standpoint. Arguably, the bigger problem is that agriculture in jungle biomes, just like in deserts, is also very difficult. This is because in the jungle, most of the nutrients that would otherwise reach the soil are stored instead in the abundant living vegetation, dead wood, and decaying leaves. When organic material in the rainforest dies and then decays, it gets recycled so rapidly by the omnipresent insects, fungi, and bacteria that little, if any, of their nutrients ever make it down into the soil below, which leaves the soil nearly sterile and atrocious to use for agriculture. So whenever humans come around and slash and burn a rainforest to clear its space out for agriculture, they are usually left with a terrible soil quality that requires massive amounts of fertilizer to actually make it productive. And then if the rainforest wasn't cleared very well, the omnipresent insects, fungi, and bacteria will then attack whatever crops do get grown. And so then that requires a further massive amount of pesticide use to keep from happening. Agriculture in former jungle lands can be productive, but it is also most often an inefficient and expensive process compared with agriculture in more temperate environments that don't require as many inputs to get going. And the jungles and rainforests found across southern Mexico are no exception to this norm. But then, to complicate most of Mexico's ability to conduct agriculture even further, nearly 70% of the country is completely covered by mountains. This makes Mexico one of the most mountainous countries in the world, on a par with Switzerland or Afghanistan for percentage of land covered by mountains. In Mexico's case, these mountains provide numerous negatives and also positives for their potential to economically develop. On the bad side, the presence of mountains only amplifies the previous negatives with developing desert and jungle biomes. Mountains are big geographic obstacles and are significantly more labor-intensive to build infrastructure over or around or under than flatland is. And then mountainous deserts and mountainous jungles, like in northern and southern Mexico, come with all of the negatives to developing deserts and jungles in addition to the negatives in developing mountains. But across the central strip of Mexico, the mountains rise up higher than they do anywhere else in the country. And they're so high up that they push a huge amount of the land here up and above the usual hot tropical climate and into a more cooler, temperate climate zone. The many high plateaus and valleys in between all of these towering mountains in the center of Mexico offer up large amounts of flatter land in elevations as high as 7,000 feet or above from sea level, high enough to lift them out of the tropical environment that the lands would otherwise be in down at lower elevations, and into a more temperate biome with cooler temperatures and less humidity, helping to mitigate the presence of diseases and insects that can be found down in the lower elevations still in the tropics, while providing a better environment to use modern construction materials and techniques in, like concrete and asphalt. At the same time, the soils that can be found within these high temperate valleys of central Mexico are also incredibly fertile and very useful for agriculture because a lot of the mountains around them are in fact volcanoes. You see, beneath the surface, the mountains and volcanoes found in central Mexico roughly correspond to the intersections of the North American Plate, the Cocos Plate, and the Rivera Plate. For millions of years now, both the Rivera and Cocos Plates have been subducting beneath the North American Plate here, which is what's generated this continuous belt of volcanoes clear across the center of Mexico. While occasionally destructive, volcanoes are also perfect for generating agriculturally useful soils, because every time they erupt, they belch out rich minerals from deep within the earth that eventually settles down into the soils below in the form of ash, acting effectively like a natural fertilizer system. Millions of years worth of eruptions along this belt of volcanoes across central Mexico filled the high valleys and plateaus up in the temperate zone in between their peaks with rich soils that would make them some of the best and easiest to use available farmland on the planet to grow calorie-intensive grains in. And that's why it shouldn't come as a surprise then that one of the most important grains in human history originally arose within this ideal environment: maize, otherwise known as corn. This is also why, despite being about 3.5 times larger in overall amounts of land, Mexico only has about the same amount of arable land as France. only about 12% of Mexico's land is actually arable and suitable for farming, and the vast majority of it is all within these rich volcanic valleys here across the center where most Mexicans have always lived out their lives. Hundreds of years ago, back in pre-Columbian times, the Valley of Mexico was also home to 5 large lakes and numerous rivers, meaning that not only were the soils very fertile, but there was also plenty of available fresh water for large-scale agriculture. And on top of that, while transportation around mountains is usually very difficult, it's a lot less difficult across the surfaces of calm lakes on boats. And so the lakes in the Valley of Mexico also provided a perfect, cheap transportation method for moving around large amounts of food and other products. It should also come as a little surprise then that the region of Mesoamerica was destined to become one of only 6 of humanity's known cradles of civilization, places where humans developed an agricultural civilization independently of the knowledge of any other civilization. More than 1,000 years before the arrival of Columbus and the Spaniards, an unknown civilization had already developed the city of Teotihuacan within this ideal environment. At that city's height during the ancient era at the same time of the Roman Empire in Europe, it likely reached an urban population of at least 125,000 people, which not only made it the most populous city in the Americas, it also made it at least the 6th most populous city in the entire world at the time. Thus, the core of Mexico's population today has really been the core of Mexico's population for thousands of years now. When the Spanish arrived in Mexico in the 16th century, the Valley of Mexico was already one of the most densely populated places in the world. The Aztec Empire counted some 6 million inhabitants, nearly on a par with the population of the whole Spanish Empire itself. While the Aztecs' capital, Tenochtitlan, high up in the Valley of Mexico, may have numbered as many as 200,000 urban inhabitants, making it a larger city at that time than any city found in Europe. After the Spaniards destroyed Tenochtitlan, Mexico City was built in its place over the ruins, and so the area remained the center of political and cultural life in Mexico. But after millions of indigenous people died from the diseases and violence that the Spaniards brought, the Valley of Mexico would never recover its pre-Columbian population again for another 4 centuries until the early 1900s. Now, more than 500 years later after the conquest, Mexico City once again ranks among the world's largest and most significant megacities, with a metropolitan population of more than 22 million people, making it the 6th most populous urban area in the world and the largest metropolitan region found anywhere outside of Asia, pretty much just like it had been for centuries before the Spanish conquest. But the core of Mexico City exists at an elevation of around 7,800 feet above sea level, far higher than any other city that's anywhere near to that same level of population. For the sake of comparison, Mexico City's elevation is on a par with the ski resort found in Aspen, high up in the Rockies of Colorado. Of the top 10 largest cities in Mexico, 4 of them are at elevations beyond 7,000 feet. 3 more are beyond 5,000 feet, and 2 more are beyond 3,000 feet. Big cities in the United States cannot be found anywhere near to these same kinds of elevations. There is only one city in the entirety of the United States with a population greater than 100,000 that can be found above 6,000 feet. Colorado Springs, and every single city in the United States with a population of more than 1 million people exists beneath 3,000 feet in elevation, less than half the elevation of Mexico City that has tens of millions of people. And this is where we get to the cons of having so many of your people very high up in the mountains like Mexico. While the mountains provide the only flat and easily arable valleys high up in the more temperate zone the country has got, they also make transportation in between all of the valleys and from any of the valleys towards the coasts a lot more challenging. Mexico City and Tenochtitlan before it exist more than 7,000 feet up above sea level, despite only being around 200 miles away from the ocean. By comparison, Kansas City in the US exists at less than 1/7 of that elevation while being more than twice as far away from a large body of water. These huge heights in Mexico mean that the rivers beginning up in the mountains flowing down to the ocean have very steep gradients and very strong currents. which ultimately means that there isn't even a single naturally navigable river in the entirety of the country. That meant that there was no possible way for people to transport themselves or their goods for cheap on rivers between the core of where Mexico's population can exist and the ocean, leaving the only possible methods for transport and trade with the greater outside world to more expensive options like roads and eventually railways and airplanes. The location around Veracruz on Mexico's coastal lowlands on the Gulf of Mexico proved to be the only suitable place in the pre-industrial era to establish a major port in the country at. It is strategically only 200 miles away from the core of Mexico City and formerly Tenochtitlan, and it has the only natural harbor that can be found for hundreds of miles all along Mexico's almost entirely flat and exposed coastline with the Gulf. As such, Veracruz was destined to become the most significant port in the country before the Industrial Revolution, and it continues to be Mexico's most significant port on its east coast on the Gulf. But at the same time, Veracruz has also been successfully used as a staging ground by hostile outside invaders to capture and occupy Mexico City from on 3 separate occasions: by Cortez and the Spaniards in the 16th century, and by the Americans and the French alike in the 19th century. The mountains around Mexico's core provide an element of protection from external attacks, but they have also historically kept Mexican power contained and away from the coasts. Thus, unable to project significant power into the oceans, Mexican states in the past have struggled to prevent large hostile maritime powers from landing on their shores and marching into their mountain fortress in the center. The control of Veracruz and the coastal lowlands around it is thus imperative to the safety of any Mexican state. And sure enough, Veracruz was Mexico's most significant port for centuries prior to the 20th century. But connecting this crucial port at Veracruz at sea level up to the core in Mexico City more than 7,000 feet higher proved to be an enormous challenge to actually overcome, even though the distance as the crow flies was only 200 miles. The two cities were never even successfully connected by a railroad until 1873, finally opening up transport to and from the population core to the ocean by rail. But by that same time, with their significantly flatter, lower, and easier to develop lands, the United States had already built well over 50,000 miles of their own railroads, 200 times more length of track than existed between Mexico City and Veracruz, and thus opening up significantly more lands to people and trade than what was remotely possible in Mexico. And just like it was difficult to build infrastructure links between the capital and Mexico's greatest pre-industrial port, it has also always been difficult to build out infrastructure links between the capital and its own valley and all the other major population centers in their own separate valleys. In reality, Mexico functions a lot more like a splintered mosaic of patched together autonomous valleys than a single centralized state. And it's always been that way for millennia. Without any navigable rivers to use for cheap, it is difficult and expensive to build roads or railroads to snake through the many mountains and connect one of the high temperate valleys to another high temperate valley or the ocean. That ultimately means that it's difficult in Mexico to generate a surplus of excess capital, because inexpensive transportation options that would otherwise generate capital just don't really exist like they do elsewhere. Building out the transportation infrastructure required for trade requires a lot of capital to start with, which is difficult to acquire in Mexico because of the lack of cheap transportation to begin with, which most often means that the large amounts of capital required to build the transportation infrastructure must come from either foreign investment or from entities that already happen to have a lot of capital. Simultaneously, this geographic reality also makes it difficult for any centralized authority in Mexico City to project power and influence from beyond their immediate valley to the other scattered and separated parts of the country. And it makes it difficult for any of the temperate valleys in the center to conduct trade with the parts of Mexico to the north and the south in the deserts or the jungles, which only further exacerbates their already major challenges to economic development and supporting large numbers of people. In this way, Mexico struggles with very similar geographic problems as Afghanistan. Both are extremely mountainous countries that are difficult to enforce power across from a centralized point, like Kabul or Mexico City. The many valleys in between the mountains where the people actually live are separated from all of the other valleys by mountains and connected only by narrow choke points, through which expensive roads and railways can be constructed, but also in which local powers can easily blockade or control. Both geographies encourage and enable high degrees of localized autonomy in the regions separated by mountains from the capital, and both geographies prevent centralized power from adequately being able to police and enforce the rule of law everywhere it wants at all times. Such geographies have therefore given rise to autonomous warlord-style factions, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, and the many autonomous cartels that operate across Mexico, largely with impunity from the central government in Mexico City. As discussed previously, Mexico's borders in the south with Guatemala and Belize are underpopulated and covered by thick rainforests and jungles, with only 8 paved roads across them. It is simply impossible for the Mexican government to adequately police and patrol the entire thing. And that makes it the perfect location for smuggling illicit substances and weapons across, coming in from Central and South America. Simultaneously, Mexico's border in the north with the United States runs for more than 2,000 miles across almost equally sparsely populated barren territory that is separated by hundreds of miles of almost empty mountainous desert between it and the core of Mexico's population up in the high temperate valleys of the center. Just like their borders in the south, the Mexican government could never possibly hope to police or patrol the entire stretch of their side of the border. Most of it is simply too remote and too far away from Mexico's most major population centers in the middle of the country. But remember that population density map of Mexico we used from before? It's interesting to look at it again now with all this context. Because while most Mexicans live where you'd expect them to in the ideal agricultural environments of the center, there are lots of pockets of extremely high population density surrounded by almost nothing that can be found all along the Mexico-US border in the north. And what's even more interesting is that all of these Mexican cities along the northern border have significantly higher populations than their American counterparts on the other side of them do. Tijuana, Juarez, Nuevo Laredo, Reynosa, and Matamoros all have much higher populations than the American cities immediately adjacent to them to the north, which has a lot to do with institutional reasons in addition to geographic reasons. It might seem strange to say, but Mexico's greatest geographic advantage compared to a place with similar geography like Afghanistan is that, unlike Afghanistan, Mexico is placed directly adjacent to the United States, the single largest consumer market on the planet. As such, beginning in the 1960s, the Mexican and American governments began entering into a series of understandings known as the Maquiladora Agreement. Essentially, the agreement stipulated that factories that produced goods within Mexico's border towns could export those goods duty-free right across the border into the United States. Big corporations immediately recognized the opportunity this provided. They could set up factories immediately across from the United States, take advantage of the comparatively much cheaper Mexican labor to build their products, and then transport those cheaply made products duty-free right across into the United States, and take advantage of America's enormous highway system to ship them pretty much anywhere in the country on the backs of trucks. Thousands of these border factories or maquiladoras were set up in the decades that followed, and with them, tens to hundreds of thousands of new factory jobs were created that lured in workers from Mexico's historic core across the center of the country. This is the reason why all of Mexico's border towns are so much more heavily populated than their American counterparts are, and a large part of the reason why, compared to the 1895 census in Mexico, a slightly higher percentage of Mexicans today live outside of the central historic core than they had back then. Eventually, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, that was signed in 1994, expanded the system even further, from being limited only to the Mexican border towns to the entirety of Mexico, enabling factories anywhere in the country to export their goods duty-free to the United States. But the proximity of the border towns to the US market, along with nearby major cities like Hermosillo, Chihuahua, and Monterrey, ensured that they would remain more financially competitive than the factories further away in the Mexican core, since they could continue exporting goods to the United States quicker and for cheaper. In economic terms, all of these cities operate more closely to being satellite cities of the United States, rather than an extension of the core of Mexico up in the Central Highlands. Mexico's friendly relationship with the United States has ultimately turned out to be the country's best answer at overcoming its harsh geographic limitations. And the maquiladoras aren't the only consequence. ever since the shale gas revolution in the United States that began in the early 2010s. More and more natural gas pipelines have been getting built out from the US to Mexico. As of the production of this video, 17 natural gas pipelines already exist spanning across the US-Mexico border that collectively export nearly 1/3 of all the natural gas the United States exports abroad, in turn providing more than 3/4 of Mexico's entire supply of natural gas. Now, this abundant and cheap supply of natural gas coming in from the United States is doing two things. First, it is effectively turbocharging the Mexican economy by providing abundant, cheap natural gas to power factories, cascading on the pre-existing advantages of Mexico's comparatively cheaper labor and ability to export products duty-free into the United States. Now, because of Mexico's geography and correspondingly limited ability to generate surplus capital, Mexican labor is comparatively cheaper than it is elsewhere. Because of enormous and cheap US natural gas supplies, Mexican electricity rates to power their factories is also comparatively cheaper than it is elsewhere. And because they are located directly adjacent to the United States, these factories with cheap labor and cheap electricity can easily and cheaply export their finished products to the United States, and then utilize the American highway and rail system to cheaply get their goods anywhere across the country. In short, it is all a perfect recipe for Mexico to develop into a manufacturing superpower. And companies from around the world have already begun to take notice of Mexico's advantages. Nissan already manufactures more cars in Mexico than they do back home in Japan. By 2021, Mexico had soared through the ranks to become the 5th largest exporter of cars in the world and is rapidly catching up to the South Koreans, who are in 4th place for now. And the car industry is only one of dozens of examples exactly like this. By 2019, Mexico had suddenly displaced Canada and China and emerged as the United States' new largest trading partner, a position it is likely to maintain for all of the foreseeable future because of all the advantages that this video has highlighted. This ultimately all implies that over time, more and more factories and manufacturing jobs are likely to open up near the border region within the north of Mexico near to the United States, a trend that will impact where Mexico's people ultimately live out their lives as more and more leave from the historic population core in the center for the new job opportunities opening up in the north. Mexico ended up discovering exactly how to transform their mostly negative geography into a positive, and it will be interesting to see how that influences the pace of Mexico's population distribution over the coming decades. Perhaps with time, most Mexicans in the country will finally live beyond the historic core where the majority has lived for thousands of years. The past 130 years saw the distribution steadily equalize from 55-45 to 51-49, so who's to know where the trend will continue going throughout the rest of the 21st century?